1810, a woman by the name of Elizabeth Scott was born in the small community of Walnut Grove, South Carolina. Her skin was of bright complexion, her hair was loose and straight with the occasional wave. She was a child of a long lineage of free people of color who were born in the antebellum South, Upper South during that period. Her ancestry included the first African slaves brought to Virginia in 1619 and their union with indentured servant European women who had come to the British North American colonies seeking something better. At the time of Elizabeth's birth, her race was marked as mulatto, meaning of mixed ancestry, usually denoting a person of both sub-Saharan African ancestry and white European ancestry as well, but also referring to any person of any admixture in that period. Now let's skip forward to 1882. Elizabeth still lives in the exact same community she's grown up in, but at this time, her family has accumulated large portions of land. On top of that, Elizabeth is educated and a nurse. She would reside in this community until her death in 1882, and on her death certificate, she was marked as Black. Elizabeth would undergo this racial reshifting and recategorization over 15 times throughout her lifetime, going back and forth between white, mulatto, and eventually when she died, Black. How was that possible? Good evening, everyone. My name is Shaquan Mcdowell, and I came here to shake things up a bit, to cause us to consider or reconsider an identity that impacts the way we see ourselves and the way we see those around us. I'm an alumni of Brandeis University, where we are today, graduating last May, and during my time here, I studied the areas of politics and history with an early US concentration in both. Essentially what that means to all of you is that I spent most of my time here thumbing through old documents that most people could care less about. But that's cool, because there's so many of these old documents to look through. Well, I enjoyed it. On top of that, because there are so many of these old documents, and because they're important to the things that I study, I spent a lot less money on textbooks than some of my friends who spent $500 or more trying to figure out how life works. But in all seriousness, what brought me here to the stage and what brought me to history is actually deeply personal. You see, as a Black American, my history has often been phrased in a certain framework, and it goes a little like this. In the early 17th century, my ancestors were enslaved and brought to America. In 1865, thanks to Abraham Lincoln, we received emancipation. Sometimes after that, the Civil Rights Movement happened, and then we jumped straight forward to 2008 and we all celebrate Barack Obama, whom I love too. But I was certain there was more to learn about my history than just those things. And it was this deep desire to learn more about where I came from that led me to genealogy. You see, for over 15 years, I have been a genealogical fanatic. And I'm only 22, so that should tell you a lot about me. In all honesty, I love being given the opportunity to look at those who lived before us and being able to compare how their lives differed, or in many ways are very much similar to the lives we live today. I consider myself an arborist of sorts because I construct family trees at my leisure, and I'm talking all the time, every single day. I did it so much during my time here at Brandeis that I would not be surprised that after I do this talk and I walk off the stage, someone will come up to me and say, "I just knew you would do a talk on history." Yes, I did. Furthermore, I'm pretty sure that my family and friends who came to support me are coming to support me because of this talk, but also are coming to support the hope and the idea that me doing this talk will serve as an outlet from this conversation for a couple of days. And I really don't blame them. It was during this genealogical exploration for myself that I came across Elizabeth. Elizabeth Scott, the woman that I mentioned in the beginning, is my 5th great-grandmother. And that town of Walnut Grove that I mentioned is now a town called Roebuck, South Carolina, where I spent a lot of my summers growing up. At first, nothing really intrigued me about Elizabeth. I considered her just another thread in the fabric that's my history, that's come to make me. But that's until I came to see the versatility in her census records. Just to give you a little understanding, the United States Census was first commissioned in 1790. That's just 20 years before Elizabeth was born about 15 years after the American Revolution started. On the census, it was to be commissioned every 10 years, and it still is. So next year, in 2020, when someone shows up at your doorstep and starts asking you these deeply personal questions, do not be alarmed. That is just the US government. You can decide if that's something to be concerned about. But they would ask questions in regards to a person's name, their age, their occupation, and their race. And it's this thing called race that I want to take a moment and consider a few questions about. Now, these questions are rhetorical. They do not require your physical or outward response, but they are things that I want you to consider internally. The first one being this. How many of you all view your race as a significant portion of your identity? How many of you all believe that your race is accurately defined by the society that you live in? Let's continue on. This is what intrigued me about Elizabeth. You see, she had a little difficulty fitting into those categories defined for her in the census. She had problems with this thing we call the color line. In 1840, Elizabeth was white. In 1850, she was mulatto. In 1880, she was black. I remember calling up a local genealogical society in South Carolina and asking for more information about Elizabeth, hoping that they could find documents to help me learn more about who she was, what her life was like. The woman came back on the phone after I had told her some things, and she said to me, well, we have a white one and we have a mulatto one. Which one do you want? And because I'm from the South, I do get to do that stereotypical Southern accent. It wasn't before I took a moment to tell her about the unique situation that Elizabeth had lived in that she came to realize this woman, a trained genealogist who had been doing this for years, that these two individuals who she thought were different were actually one and the same. And it's this enigma that intrigued me about Elizabeth. So, what did I do? I decided to learn more about racial classification during the time that Elizabeth existed. And here's what I found. Essentially, free people of color during that time enjoyed a different degree of racial fluidity. And it's because different states throughout the United States defined race depending on how they wanted to. If they couldn't figure out what you were or where you came from, well, they essentially just guessed. So what changed? The end of the Civil War, the end of slavery, and the rise of Jim Crow, for one. You see, Elizabeth lived during an era, or was born in the era at least, when most of the people of color in the United States were enslaved. This meant for white people, they didn't have to fear that the class of people of color in general would grow in class and grow and become openly mobile. People of color who were free enjoyed a larger degree of fluidity in the society they lived in. At the conclusion of 1865, however, and once the large majority of the people of color inside the United States became free as well, this became a rising concern. The fear of miscegenation and upward mobility of people of color as a class in its entirety became a fear across white people in the United States. As such, our legislation starts to reflect that fear and sentiment. Take 1910, for instance. Tennessee adopted a policy called the one-drop rule. That essentially meant that any person who had any sliver of African ancestry, no matter how minute, was therefore to be categorized as black. That didn't exist before then. But afterwards, it became the standard doctrine throughout all the United States. So what does this mean? Well, let's look at one of Elizabeth's grandchildren and my third great-grandmother to find out. The woman on the screen is Lodurska Scott, pictured with her brothers Madison to the right and her brother Boyd to the left. As I previously mentioned, Lodurska is my third great-grandmother and Elizabeth's grandchild. Lodurska resided in the exact same community that Elizabeth had lived in. But on government documentation and every census she was marked on, Lodurska was marked as black. Although often phenotypically confused as white, government documentation always insisted that her race would be black. Like Elizabeth, Lodurska's race was undefined, but in a different way. There was a discrepancy in what people saw and what official documentation insisted. But here's the thing. Neither one of them were exactly right. So why does the story of Loderska and Elizabeth matter to us at all? Well, it matters to us because of that thing called race. Race. It's an idea that's encapsulated Western society, and it's told us that based on how a person looks, we can understand certain things about them, ethnically, culturally, and historically. We've been conditioned to believe that without conversation at all, and just based on how a person looks, we can instantly understand who they are, what they are, and where they come from. Even in a society like ours, where we claim to be moving towards post-racial sentiments, this methodology is still commonly practiced. But it's not always right. The way a person looks and the thoughts you develop because of them aren't always true or valid. As we've seen via Loderska and Elizabeth, the way a person looks and who they actually are can be quite misleading. You see, using race as an identifier has problems that lie in two things. One, the assumption that race in itself is a static identifier. That the way that a person's race is defined today is the same bracket that their predecessors fell into. That the race is defined today is the way that it was defined yesterday. That the way that race is defined today is the exact same way it will be defined 10 years from now. And two, the use of race as a prejudice apparatus at all. The idea that you can look at a person and understand everything about their history or what they believe is just stupid. But it's still a methodology that we fall privy to. It's a prejudice that we still utilize. Think about certain groups or movements. We believe that we can look at a person and identify how will they will vote or what social movements they'll align with. Furthermore, it falls even closer to Brandeis' campus, closer to home. Take a friend of mine, for example. Her skin is of olive complexion. Her hair is straight as well. She grew up in Los Angeles, California. But every time a person sees her, they think if they come up to her and start speaking in Spanish, she will reply to them fluently. The fact is, her Spanish is not that great. They only believe that because they assume that based on her appearance, she's of Latinx ancestry. Yet just a year ago, she took a genetic test. The fact is, she's 85% European, none of that coming from Latin America at all. But based on her phenotype, people think that it is. The use of race, the categorizations, and the prejudice we place behind them is something that impacts the way that we navigate within ourselves and the way we navigate the society we function in. I am a Black American man, and I am proud of it. But I descend from people who didn't fit so neatly inside the boxes we defined for them. Perhaps we should learn to be more inquisitive via conversation, rather assumptive, based purely on phenotype. Thank you.